Call me Francis Tucket. Remember, yesterday he found two children in a wagon. Their dad was dead. Here we go. We're going to read chapter 9 and 10. 9 is really short. Again, the mule saved him. It was one thing to say they were going to go west, something else again to do it. The children were small, but they could not have all three ridden the mare, and they couldn't have walked. Francis could have walked and led them on the mare and was thinking of doing just that when he saw the mule standing by the wagon. Could you carry them? He said aloud, and Lottie misunderstood, thought he was talking to her.
You mean me? Could I carry Billy? Well, for a little ways.
No, I was talking to the mule.
The mule? You were talking to a mule? Do they know how to talk? They look so dumb the way they just stand all the time, except this one seems to eat more than anything I've seen.
Is there a halter in the wagon?
Yeah, Paul, he kept extra ones for the horses, but I'm not sure he'd want you taking them. Oh, I guess it doesn't matter, does it?
She climbed into the wagon and came out in a moment with a halter. Francis tied the mare to the wagon wheel and dismounted, walked up to the mule with the halter, and was surprised when the mule stuck his head through it and let him buckle it in place.
I thought mules were supposed to be fractious, Lottie said. Pa, he said mules were all the time being fractious, but your mule seems to be a right nice fellow. Time was I saw a mule belonged to our neighbor. Her name was Nancy, and she had red hair and lived a mile away down a rocky road and worked all the time. Anyway, she had a mule named of Plover, and he could kick so fast he'd kick a rock if you threw it at his back end.
Francis let her talk and used a rope to tie a folded blanket from the wagon on the mule's back. It was a makeshift at best, but it would give them something to sit on. He had thought fleetingly of trying to harness the mule and the mare to pull the wagon, but it was too heavy, and they were much too lightweight to take the load for very long. Besides, he didn't want to be encumbered with a wagon. They might hit rough country where a wagon couldn't go. There were other things he took from the wagon, another rifle, and under the seat, wrapped in a grease-stained sack of soft leather, he found a .44 Colt's cap and ball revolver. He wasn't much on handguns. They were mostly inaccurate and didn't have any range or punch, but it held 6 balls, and he thought there might come a time when he would need to shoot without reloading, so he took it, along with a bullet mold and a box of caps and a full flask of powder. There was some flour. He ate half a handful raw, and some matches and salt and a cast iron Dutch oven with a lid. All of this he placed in a canvas bag he found in the wagon, which he hung on the mule. He took 2 more blankets and the quilt to make a bedroll for the children, cut a large piece of canvas from the top of the wagon for a tent or lean-to, rolled them all and tied them across the mule's shoulders and stood back to look at it. It was bulky, but light, and the 2 children together wouldn't make half a man. They were skinny as well as small, and he thought the mule would not have any trouble carrying them. He led the mule up to the rear of the wagon and reached in, loaded Billy and Lottie under the mule's back. The mule took the load easily and didn't flinch or buck, for which Francis was thankful. Then he mounted the mare, took the mule's lead rope in his hand, and left the wagon. He did not look back for some time, and when he did, the wagon was a spot in the endless grass, and Lottie was looking straight at him. But the boy had somehow turned around on the mule and was sitting backward, sucking his thumb, still silent, staring at the wagon. Man, that's a tough moment. The Indians found them in the afternoon. Or, in reality, Francis and the Indians found each other. Francis and the children started from the wagon about noon, working west and slightly north. He could think of no reason for the northerly movement except that it seemed right, a hunch, and he decided to follow it, hoping to cut a wagon train, the one he'd left or the one that had set the children and their father out. But he understood there was little chance. The boredom set back in. There were long silences while they rode. Francis thought of his family, his mind triggered by the 2 children with him, Ma, Pa, his little sister Rebecca. He kept wondering how she was doing. He could not remember her face, how she looked, and found himself thinking that she must look a lot like Lottie. Billy seemed to prefer sitting backward on the mule, sucking his thumb. The only time he changed was when Francis gave them each a piece of the venison jerky he brought from the deer he'd killed. Billy grabbed the meat like a puppy, revealing a thumb that was amazingly white and clean, and almost swallowed the whole before going back to thumb sucking. The silences were punctuated at intervals by Lottie, who would go off, as Frances came to think of it, at the slightest provocation, the sunbonnet wobbling as she talked.
See that buzzard up there? How can they fly like that without ever moving their wings? Just hang there like they was floating on the air. Is it like they float there? Like sticks float on water? How can the air be thick enough for them to float that way when it's still thin enough to breathe? I wish I could do that. Just float up there and see it all forever and ever.
The talk had a lulling effect, and between the boredom of the prairie, which he knew was deceptive, and Lottie going on, he soon fell into a kind of haze. He should have known better. Every time he'd let his guard down, something had come at him. But he rode and dozed, the mule following easily, and Lottie was talking about the neighbor Nancy.
She goes to making things that are so pretty that they take your breath away. Things to put on shelves and just look at, like little boxes with trees on them and designs and colors. Oh,
The stopping startled Francis. His eyes had been half closed, his body rolling with the motion of the mare, his mind on a million other things, and when she stopped talking, he snapped his eyes open, but it was too late. In front of him on either side were two Indian men. One had a rifle and the other a bow with an arrow in the string, and they were both on foot, almost unheard of on the prairie. The one on the left was older, a grown man. The one on the right was young, 15, 16, and they were standing looking at him. Francis's rifle was across his lap. The handgun hung in the sack off the saddle horn. The two extra rifles were back on the mule. All of this, the Indians, the way they looked not 20 feet away, their weapons, his own weapons, not being ready, all of this he registered in half a second, and at the same time he knew that there was no time. Even if he could swing the rifle up and get a shot off at one of them, the other would get him. It could have gone in any direction, and for a full 5 seconds it seemed like an hour. The tension was wound so tight Francis could hear his heart beating. He stared at them. They looked at him. Then two things. He saw they were not wearing paint, which they would be wearing if they were looking to war, and at the same time the older of the two smiled and said something to the other, who smiled as well. They were looking back at Lottie and Billy, who was still sitting the mule backward, ignoring the Indians. Lottie had seen them, but she had to hold her head back to peer out from beneath the flopping aim of her sunbonnet.
are they savages?
She asked. Be quiet, Francis said.
Because if they are, savages, then I think maybe you should do something. Of course, I never have seen no savages and only heard about them in the wagon train where everybody said if they come upon you, they'd cut you open and eat your heart, and I don't want nobody cutting me open and eating my heart out, so maybe...
The older Indian's smile widened, and he made a sign in front of his mouth, his fingers fluttering and moving away. Francis knew some sign from when he'd lived with the Indians, and literally the sign meant butterflies or birds flying. But in front of his mouth it meant words flying, and Francis nodded and smiled back and imitated the sign in front of his own mouth. The young Indian put his bow down, took his fingers off the string, and Francis knew it was over. English? Francis asked, using sign. Do you talk English? The boy shook his head, but the man nodded. Speak small, not big. Why you here? His hands moved when he spoke, and making sign to back up his spotty English. I'm looking for a wagon train. I've been lost. Francis also made sign, but he was not as good as the Indian and much slower. Young lost too? Francis nodded. I found them back almost a day. Their father died of the water sickness, and I brought them with me. Both of the Indians stepped back at this. They knew of cholera. Francis had heard of whole villages being killed in 2 or 3 days, and like Francis, they did not know how it spread. It's all right now, Francis said. Good, good. They're not sick now, but that way a day, he pointed in the direction they'd come, that way there's a wagon where the sickness came from. The man nodded and made a sign for peace, his palm up and facing out, so like that. And the boy did the same, and Francis raised his hand and showed his palm. Hunt, the man said, pointing south. That way. Francis nodded and pointed west. We go there. Because he couldn't resist it, the thought had been on his mind since he'd first seen them. He asked, why no horses? From living with and watching the Indians, he knew they wouldn't move 15 feet without a horse under them. They were all, man, woman, and child, better riders than Francis, and Jason Grimes had told him he thought they were born on a horse. 2 men hunting on foot was rare, but the man made the sign on his head for antlers. Deer, better on foot, low in grass, closer, shoot more. Horses back there with family. He made a sign for children and women. Waiting for meat, he smiled. Francis nodded, remembering the buck he'd killed by waiting in the grass. He started to say more, but the mare moved under him, making him look down, and when he looked up, they were gone, vanished in the grass.
I guess they weren't savages.
Lottie said. No, Francis squeezed the mare with his legs, and she started forward, the mule keeping up. They were people just like us, looking for food. The thought seemed to quiet Lottie, and Francis set the direction back to the north and west, but determined not to lose his alertness again. The children posed a real problem. Alone, if something bad did happen, he could cut and run and have a chance of getting out of it. There were horses faster than the mare, but not many quicker or more sure of foot, and that gave Francis some advantage. But Lottie and Billy changed everything. The mule couldn't move fast, wouldn't carry them out of danger if it came, and that made it doubly important for Francis to be aware of what was coming to get time to react or hide. Then there was food. He could go 2 or 3 days without eating, but he didn't think it was good for young to go that long. They had to eat on a more regular basis. All he had left was the semi-dried venison, and they ate from that most of the day. Riding along, both children had been nearly starved and ate ravenously to make up for it, and the jerky was nearly gone. He would have to hunt soon, get another deer, or better yet, a buffalo, which would slow them down, and at first that irritated him until he remembered that there wasn't a hurry to get anywhere because he didn't know where he was or where to go. The problem was that suddenly the prairie was bare. Where he'd been seeing small groups of buffalo out ahead, there didn't seem to be any for miles, and he couldn't see a deer or antelope. They rode the rest of the day, Francis alert and looking for game, and finally, just before dusk, he shot a jackrabbit. We'll stop for the night now, he said, lifting the children off the mule. Gather wood for a fire so we can cook this rabbit. Lottie stretched and helped Billy take a few steps to shake his legs out.
Pa, he tried to cook one of them once when we were on the wagon with the wagon train, and we like to broke our teeth chewing. We need some good meat, some more deer meat. That's the kind of meat we need. Some good red meat with fat on it to make drippings.
She talked constantly, but she worked as she spoke, finding dry wood and sticks, and Billy helped her. By the time Francis had finished hobbling the mare, the mule would stay without it. They had a stack of wood large enough to last all night. Francis took some kindling sticks, shaved them with his knife to get curls, laid a fire in it, and lit it.
You keep wood on it.
You keep wood on it, he told Lottie. I'll clean the rabbit. He quickly gutted and skinned the rabbit and cut it into smaller pieces. There was no water where they stopped, so he poured some from a canteen into the Dutch oven and put the rabbit into the water. He added a handful of flour for thickening and cut 3 chunks of venison to drop in on top. Then he put the lid on and shoved the cast pot into the fire. Stew, he said, an hour or so.
I like stew, Lottie said. I didn't mean back then that I didn't like stew and much and such like. I am not picky. I'm not a picky eater like some, being as I'll eat almost anything, though I'm not fond of bugs, nor the reptile along the ground. Billy here will eat a bug in a second. He just loves 'em. Not me, though.
Billy was sitting on a blanket staring at the flames, and Francis studied him. Doesn't he ever talk?
Lottie nodded. Sure, he just don't have anything to say. Sometimes he'll talk your ear off. I remember once, I think it was last week, he looked me right in the eye and he said, I'm thirsty. Plain as day. Must have been 6-7 days ago.
She trailed off, and the quiet was so sudden, Francis thought she must have seen something. But he looked at her and saw she was crying quietly, looking into the flames.
It was to Pa, he said it. I miss Pa.
Francis tried to think of something to say, but there was nothing. He remembered when he'd first been kidnapped and then seen a toy that had belonged to his sister Rebecca and thought Rebecca was dead. The empty feeling, the numbness, no words could help. So he put more wood on the fire and covered the 2 children to get them to sleep, and when they were at last both sleeping, he moved away from the fire to doze back in the grass with his rifle across his lap and a blanket over his shoulders. Twice in the night he heard wolves. They sang deeper and longer than the yipping coyotes, and he tried not to think of the children's father alone on the prairie. That was chapter 9 and 10. Be back later. Bye.